Okay, the recording has started. Hello, internet, for when this goes on the video later. Thanks for coming, everybody. You know, I had a prediction of how this would go, and so far my prediction is bearing out exactly. I expected the first one to be a lot of people, then I expected the second one to go way down, and then I expected it to kind of creep back up over time, and it seems like that's what's happening. I'm happy to see some familiar faces. I was chatting with Andrew and Rick just before the recording, and my new friend Matt in Austin. And I see we got Helmet, Jonathan Bennett. I remember you from before. Colin, if you were here before, I missed you. Is this your first time? First time? Yeah.
First one.
Well,
long time listener, first time video shower upper.
Yeah. Well, welcome. Glad to have you here.
Earl
Gresh.
Rails video?
Say that again, Andrew.
Is he the guy from the Go Rails video?
Yep.
One of, yes.
Yeah, I think I just watched one of your videos the other day on the Extend Self. It's a great video.
Oh yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
I'm looking forward to the ones about creating a gem.
Yeah, let's see. I was going to say Earl Gresh. I recognize the name. Guanting, I remember you from before, I think. Maybe we've chatted in the Code with Jason Slack group a little bit too.
Yep.
And I'm sure we have some other repeat attendees. I apologize if I'm not familiar with your name yet. I'll get to know you over time. It's about 9:05. I usually give people until about 5 after to join, and then people. Oh, Ben Robinson, I recognize you now that your video's showing. I expect that people will be joining all throughout this call. It's crazy how late some people join. Some people join like half an hour into it. Some people join when there's like 10 minutes left. I don't know what they expect to get out of it at that point in time, but it does happen. But anyway, we'll just get started and people will probably join in the middle, and that's fine. So today's topic is Rails models, and it might sound boring, but I promise you it's not. This is something that when I made the realization that I'm about to communicate, it's not an overstatement to say that it changed the whole way that I look at Rails, and it changed the whole way that I develop Rails applications. So I'm going to pull up my notes and get into it. So first of all, why do I want to talk about this topic of Rails models? And the reason is, in my experience, a lot of Rails developers, including myself for the first couple of years of dealing with Rails, working in Rails, a lot of Rails developers have an overly narrow view of what a model is. And that limits you and constrains you if you have this narrow conception. And so what I hope I can help you do, if you haven't already, is make this realization that a model can be this different thing from how we normally think about it. So that's why I want to talk about it. That's what we're going to talk about today. And if we reconceive of what a model is, models can be much more versatile and useful, and we can actually express a larger proportion of our applications as models. And so these things people do where they put things in helpers and service objects and stuff like that, we don't have to do a lot of that stuff. We can actually put it in the models if we only think of models in this different way. So what do I mean? What's this different way of looking at models? First of all, let me explain the limited way that a lot of people look at Rails models. And that's, of course, that a lot of people see this one-to-one relationship between a Rails model and a database table. To a lot of people, a Rails model is an ActiveRecord model. That's obviously a very natural conclusion to come to, because when you do Rails generate scaffold customer, you get all this customer stuff, a view, a controller, a model, a database table. It kind of seems like it all goes together, which it does. And in the beginning, your whole Rails application is probably made out of these scaffolded resources. And so, again, I drew this conclusion myself when I was in my first couple of years of Rails development, that a model means an ActiveRecord model. But it doesn't have to mean that. So let's zoom out a little bit and let's forget about Rails. Let's leave Rails and not talk about Rails models, but let's just talk about models in programming. And in fact, let's not even talk about models in programming. Let's just talk conceptually. What is a model in general? Because this is not a concept that's unique to programming or originated in programming, probably. There is this thing called scientific modeling. And I got curious and I looked it up on Wikipedia to just see what it had to say about scientific modeling. And I thought the definition was kind of interesting, so I'll just read it for you guys. Scientific modeling is a scientific activity, the aim of which is to make a particular part or feature of the world easier to understand, define, quantify, visualize, or simulate by referencing it to existing and usually commonly accepted knowledge. That's a bit of a mouthful, so I'm going to read it one more time. Scientific modeling is a scientific activity, the aim of which is to make a particular part or feature of the world easier to understand, define, quantify, visualize, or simulate by referencing it to existing and usually commonly accepted knowledge. I'll give a couple examples of models. And I'm not going to claim that these are like scientific models, but let's just talk about models of things that you could conceivably have. So here's one. Think about a virus. We all have a mental model of a virus. We go out and we catch a cold. We might think of these little thingies. Maybe we don't have a super precise idea of what a virus looks like. But when somebody sneezes, we imagine like these millions of tiny things, and we breathe them in, and then the viruses make us sick. And then we have a model of how our bodies react to a virus, and then eventually get better and the virus goes away or whatever. None of us probably has a super accurate or precise model of what a virus really is. Certainly not to the degree of accuracy and precision as a doctor does, but our model is a sufficiently useful approximation to the truth. And that's my personal definition of a model, is a useful approximation to the truth. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but when we code models into our applications, we're not trying to model every single detail about everything we're working with. It's just a useful approximation to the truth. Anyway, that's one example of a model that doesn't have anything to do with programming. Here's another one. I read this Richard Dawkins book called The Magic of Reality. And in that book, he said that before any scientist had ever looked at an atom, scientists had a model of what an atom looked like. And I don't know what exactly this model was that these scientists had, but you can kind of imagine. Maybe the ancient Greeks who first thought of the universe being composed of these atoms, they thought of them as these little balls, maybe, I'm just guessing. But you don't have to have the complete and accurate picture of the protons and neutrons and all that stuff. You can have a useful approximation to the truth. I'll give one more example. You could have a model of a tree. So my model of a tree, again, isn't 100% precise and accurate. I don't know all the mechanics of how a tree pumps water up to its leaves and stuff like that. I don't know exactly what makes a tree change colors and loses its leaves in the in the fall or anything like that. I interact with trees in a very limited way. Sometimes on my I live in the woods. Sometimes on my property, a tree falls and I take my chainsaw and I cut it up. I know some stuff about trees. And so I have a certain model of trees. I've modeled certain aspects of trees in my mind, but I don't need to understand every little detail of everything I possibly could know about a tree in order to be able to successfully interact with trees in the ways that I need to interact with them. So that's another example of a model a person could have. I think you guys get the picture. So we've zoomed all the way out to forget about programming. We're just talking about a model in general. Now let's talk about modeling in a programming context. So I took this definition from Wikipedia. Scientific modeling is a scientific activity, the aim of which is to make a particular part or feature of the world easier to understand, define, quantify, visualize, or simulate by referencing it to an existing and usually commonly accepted knowledge. And I adapted that to my own definition of a model. So here's what I came up for that. Modeling is a programming activity, the aim of which is to make a particular part of a program easier to understand and work with by representing parts of reality in a simplified way that can be expressed in code. And I want to re-emphasize this point that when we model something, we're not trying to simulate the whole entire thing most of the time. We're just taking some aspect of it that we're interested in and creating a useful approximation to the truth. Okay, so that's how I think about that. A couple statements. It's probably clear now that it's my opinion that a model doesn't have to have anything to do with ActiveRecord. We could model things completely independently of anything to do with the database. And so in my Rails applications, I do have ActiveRecord models, but in addition to those, right in the app models directory, I have a whole bunch of other models that don't have anything to do with ActiveRecord. And if they're not ActiveRecord, what are they? Most of them are just poros, plain old Ruby objects. You don't need anything more to have a very rich and useful model. And side note, model can apply in two different ways. You can mean an individual model, like an individual file, or when you say the model, you could mean the whole entire model, which is all the model files in the whole application comprise the application's model. So there's kind of those two different levels. I'll also say that a model doesn't have to have anything to do with business logic or domain logic, because a lot of people define it that way. They say, what goes in app models? Well, I put my business logic in app models, or I put my domain logic in app models. I don't see why that has to be the case. I think a model can be something that models application code. Like you can model an HTTP request, for example. That's neither business logic nor domain logic. That's just application logic, but you can model that. Maybe I wouldn't put it in app models. Maybe I'd put it in the lib folder or something like that. But still, my point is you can model it. And my very last point before we kind of start an open discussion is that I think a Rails app can be comprised mostly of models. I think most things can be expressed as a model, and it can be put right in app model. And so for me, the great majority of what goes into my Rails apps is expressed as a model. And that's what I have for you. Let's open it up for questions and comments. And you can feel free to chime in verbally, or if you want to type in the chat, either way works. First, I'll ask you guys, did anybody already think about models in this way? Or does anybody, were you thinking of models in this very one-to-one Rails model is an ActiveRecord model and it's tied to a database table, and this kind of maybe started you to think in a different way? I'm curious about that.
I've just used models as like ActiveRecord models and did everything else with service objects, but you've opened my eyes over the last weeks and email posts and stuff like that about moving away from service objects to poros, in my models folder. So I'll probably
It's great to
start
hear.
experimenting with that.
Well, Helmut, that warms my heart to hear that, because I see a lot of advice online advising people to use service objects. And I'm not exactly against service objects, but I am against service objects if it's done in ignorance of this other potential way of doing it. If somebody chooses to use service objects knowing the other ways they could, then fine. But if somebody uses service objects and they don't even know about this other way of modeling, then that makes me a little bit sad. So Helmut, that makes me very happy to hear that maybe I've persuaded you a little bit or opened your eyes or whatever it is.
And I also like getting, because my service objects are often kind of very functional, like functional, just do this, do this, do this. I would like as many opportunities as I can find to think more in terms of objects, and creating poros would do that.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of the declarative paradigm. I think it's very natural for people to write in an imperative paradigm. I did, for the first, I don't know how many years of my programming career, it was mostly imperative for me. And then once I kind of understood the distinction between imperative and declarative, I thought, wow, declarative is really a lot easier to understand. And so I started to try to express my code like that. So I'm a big fan of that. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, could you explain that a little bit more? The distinction between imperative and declarative?
Yeah. So the example I always use, which I'm not sure I love this example, but I'll use it anyway. So here's an example of imperative. It's very sequential. You could say, we're going to use a peanut butter jelly sandwich as an example. So I would say, let's say I would like Helmut to make me a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. I would say, Helmut, get 2 pieces of bread, and on one piece, put some peanut butter, and on the other piece, put some jelly, and then put the 2 halves of the sandwich together, put it on a plate, and then bring it to me. That's imperative. And declarative would be, hey, Helmut, a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. It's a sandwich with 2 pieces of bread, peanut butter and jelly on it. I'd like one, please. And then he makes it happen. And so the difference is, one is sequential and step by step, and the other one, it more specifies the desired end state. And it's maybe kind of a subtle distinction. If you search for it and look at some code examples, it might become clearer.
But that example made sense. Thank you.
Oh, okay. The reason I like it is because with imperative, you kind of have to, imperative puts the job on you to keep track of the state. With the peanut butter and jelly sandwich, it's like kind of easy, but you can imagine like somebody tallying up a total or something like, or changing some attributes or something like that. It's like with each line, you have to be like, okay, this changed. Now this changed in this other way. Okay. Whereas with declarative, it just spells it out at once. That's why I prefer it. Okay, there's some comments in the chat here. So at the simplest level, model is synonymous with a class. You could say that. Can you think of a specific use case example where a service object or other class-based design pattern, such as interactors, could be justified? Yes. So the way that most people, in my perception, use service objects is basically as a synonym for the command pattern. So the command pattern is basically where You have a class that represents an action. Here's an example. In the last app that I worked on, I created a command pattern object that was called create appointment. The reason I did that was because there were a lot of things that the creation of an appointment triggered. It would send an email, it would trigger an appointment reminder, a couple other things like that. So I wanted to package all, I didn't want to use callbacks or anything like that. I wanted to package all that stuff up in one place. So I used this create appointment command pattern object. Again, in my experience, most service objects are command pattern objects. And so when there's a case where the command pattern is a good fit for the use case, then I think it would be justified. I'm not really sure what the difference between interactors and a command pattern object is. I kind of think an interactor is maybe sort of a command pattern object with some accoutrements that gives you some certain functionality. I'm not an interactor kind of guy, so I don't know that world in detail, but that's when I would use that. What I, again, don't feel great about is when people find service objects and they say, okay, this is just how we're going to code now. How do we structure our code? We structure our code using service objects, and they just do everything that way. I think that's not a very well thought out way of doing it. It confuses the idea of what's a paradigm versus what's a design pattern. Because a paradigm, for example, object-oriented programming, functional programming, procedural programming, you tend to write a whole application in one paradigm. But a design pattern is a specific solution to a specific kind of problem. And our service objects, a paradigm or a pattern, I think a lot of people who use service objects haven't thought through the answer to that question. And so again, that's the part that I don't feel great about when people do that.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, what else?
So I guess to kind of continue down that path you were just mentioning, I guess the way I kind of, especially you mentioned when you open like a services folder, they're almost always this call pattern. Do you just kind of view that as an attempt to shoehorn in some form of functional programming? Because I guess that's the way I've kind of started to see it, right? It's like, here's essentially a function that just stores some data inside of it.
Yeah. Oh, was somebody else going to say something? I thought I heard a voice. No? Okay. Yeah, I think it's an attempt at encapsulation and modularity and simplicity, which obviously are all good directions to go in, but maybe it's not the most helpful way to approach those things. Because to have an object with a single public method called call, I don't know if that really gets you all that much. Yeah, so I don't know if it's an attempt at functional programming. Again, it seems like an attempt at encapsulation, which is laudable, but again, that's not the way I would do it. I would hope people would try to create abstractions in OOP rather than going with these surface objects.
So I have a kind of a question about the inverse of this. Are there things that you've seen in model definitions that you think should not be models, other than using controllers, obviously, but are there things that just do not belong there?
That's a good question. Like, for example, is a file sitting somewhere in app models that doesn't belong there?
Yeah, like there's a PORO there, but it really shouldn't be in the models, even though it's a PORO, it's a fine class, but it really shouldn't be in the model.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't think I really have. I think the error I've seen, or not error, but I think what I've seen is overwhelmingly the opposite, where people put way less stuff in the model than they could.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what I do see, this is only tangentially related maybe, but what I do see is a lot of stuff in the form of a concern that maybe shouldn't be a concern. That's the closest thing I can think of.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. What else? All right. Well, maybe that's about all for now. I'll ask a question that I always ask at the end of these, which is, what topics would you guys like to see in the future? And feel free to, as always, feel free to type something in the chat or say it verbally. And even if it's something you've said before, feel free to say it again, because the things that keep getting brought up are the things that'll give weight and prioritize for earlier.
I can tell you one of the things that I've been struggling with and I'm going to have to struggle with soon is kind of the do's and don'ts of observer patterns in Ruby,
Okay.
because those can get a little dicey if you're not careful with them.
Okay. That's
What
something
are-
that I have basically zero experience with. So that'll be a good thing for me to research.
I would be really interested in a discussion on patterns in general, just your approaches, the thoughts, and what drives you to a specific pattern, or what patterns are good patterns to follow.
Yeah. Okay. Duly noted. Anything else?
I was thinking
Okay.
along the lines of how do you document your code? There's like RDoc and Yard, and others have different choices, I guess. And I'm always kind of like curious whether I should be using Yard or standardizing on something else.
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I don't document my code very much at all. Sometimes, like if I'm creating some kind of API, then I actually really enjoy creating documentation for those, but just regular application code, I don't do a lot of that. But that's another thing that I'm not saying that I do that necessarily because I don't think I'm smart for doing that. That's more like a bad habit on my part or something like that. Yeah. Okay.
Well, and kind of tangential to that too, I think, is at what point is it good documentation versus bad code that has to be documented because you're not writing it clearly.
Yeah. Yeah. And we could talk about comments too, because that's germane to that whole conversation. Because a lot of people, well, it's a whole can of worms, but I think comments are a good topic to discuss. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, that gives me, oh wait, it's hard to have a confusing 3-line method. That's true. That gives me some good stuff to think about. Soon I'll be announcing the topic for next week. And thank you everybody for coming. And I will see you next time.
Thanks a lot, Jason.
All right, thanks.
Good night.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.